Hey there, historians! As the United States spread further west, the frontier represented a variety of ideas. A fresh start, new opportunities, freedom from a changing society and growing cities, and more. The Rocky Mountains were practically unheard of in American conversations before Lewis and Clark. But after their travels, Americans looked to explore, exploit, and expand into new territories to make a life for themselves. Today we'll be talking about Oregon, the last unowned patch of the continental U.S. Our objectives are to explain how and why Americans began moving to the Oregon country, explain how the United States gained control of lands in Oregon, and describe how overland trails shaped the distribution of Western settlements. As you learned previously, Lewis and Clark had been tasked by President Jefferson with finding a water route to the Pacific Ocean. They were unsuccessful, but their descriptions of the territory they traveled through had an impact on American expansion. John Jacob Astor started a company called the American Fur Company. He sent mountain men to live in the West for months at a time, accumulating beaver pelts before returning home. Beaver pelts were valuable because they were used to make the fine clothing back east and in Europe. Astor became the first American millionaire. He financed an expedition to find a way through the Rocky Mountains, and his team discovered the South Pass, from which future trails would lead to Oregon and California. On the other side of the Rockies, there were still lots of beavers and a lush area ready to be cultivated. Mountain men were isolated, but held rendezvous in settlements like Astoria, where they could trade and socialize with each other from time to time. Eventually, trails were developed by mountain men, which would later be followed by people hoping to settle in Oregon. As the United States gained more land in the West, Great Britain angled to set a defined border between American lands and British Canada. At the Convention of 1818, the border was set at the 49th parallel between the Great Lakes and the Rocky Mountains. Lands beyond that were murky in terms of ownership. Russia claimed lands in Alaska and the coastline moving south. Spain tried to extend how far California really went before Mexico's independence. But Great Britain and the United States had the most reasonable claims to Oregon. They did not settle who would own the lands, leaving them free and open in the Convention of 1818. This was mainly because they weren't well explored yet. It would be silly to go to war or exchange lots of money over an unknown land, right? You may remember that in the election of 1844, a candidate campaigning on expansion, James K. Polk, won the presidency. One of his supporters' slogans was 54-40 or fight. They hoped to control the territory west of the Rockies, all the way up to the Russia-controlled Alaska, reserving none for the British, and they were willing to go to war over it. Americans had already defeated the Brits twice in the last century, right? What could go wrong? Polk, who saw a greater opportunity in fighting Mexico, decided to keep things peaceful with Great Britain. He negotiated the Oregon Treaty in 1846 that would extend the 49 degrees north line through the Rockies out to the Pacific Ocean, completing the continental expansion of the United States. Throughout the 1840s, trails were forged across the continent. Mountain men made the first rudimentary trails leading through the Rockies. Herders traveled to California to set up cattle ranches, like there were in Texas. Miners followed those trails when news of gold deposits made its way back east in 1848. We'll explore this more in a future lesson. In some areas, trails like the Santa Fe Trail had already been forged by Native Americans who had used them for trade for centuries. These trails were a pathway to living out the dreams that westward travelers had. Those wanting a better life had more of an ideal future than a destination in mind. In many cases, they could barely afford the supplies they needed to make the journey, so the system of trails guided them as they moved, influencing where they would settle. The Oregon Trail led to the Willamette Valley. The California Trail led to what is now San Francisco. The Santa Fe Trail led to Santa Fe, New Mexico. And the Mormon Trail led to Salt Lake City. These areas remain some of the most heavily settled regions of the West today. How do you think that roads you drive on now shape where you travel? Let's recap what we've learned. Oregon was mostly explored by fur-trapping mountain men. With heavier travel came the need to resolve the issue of sharing Oregon with Great Britain. Despite calls to fight for the territory, President Polk brokered an agreement with Great Britain, peacefully securing Oregon below the 49th parallel. Trails to hunting grounds, river valleys, and rendezvous led Americans to settle in San Francisco and the Willamette Valley. Other trails were forged by Native Americans or new groups like the Mormons. Most westward travelers used the trails, which affected where they settled. By 1853, the United States gained territory in Louisiana, Florida, Texas, Oregon, and the Southwest. Its destiny had truly manifested, and tens of thousands of people traveled west to settle new areas, to develop their own economy, traditions, and culture. As we continue our study of westward expansion, be on the lookout for gold. Maybe you'll strike it rich overnight. Until next time, historians, remember to always be clever. Hey.